The reaction to it was also very interesting. I also still sometimes don't know what to think about it because you have the former
Hello,
president coming to talk to our
Bitcoiners. Thank you very much. Hello, it's
like
good to be with
previously our
you.
meetup of like 10 or 20 passionate devotees, now 20, 30,000 people. So Nashville was really interesting because that's where the political side started to hit. And this is where I think in Asia and China, this will reverberate a little bit larger. But seeing all that energy, I imagine other countries, including China, have to watch because that's just like their number one priority. And so it definitely felt like the world is more focused.
Hi everyone. Today our guest is Roger Huang. He is an author. He just recently released the book Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? The Past, Present and Future of Bitcoin in Techno-Nationalist China. He's also a contributing writer to the Bitcoin magazine and Forbes. Roger, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you so much, Richard, for having me on the show. And it's a pleasure to join.
Thank you. I would like to have your take on something that's been bugging a lot of people recently. What's the situation with Bitcoin in China? Because it seems a little bit like maybe we have a race for Bitcoin between the two major economies. In January, we had the ETFs accepted in the US. Recently in Hong Kong, they differ between each other. They are different, but we see much bigger inflows in the US, smaller in China. How do you see this? Why are the inflows in China smaller, although actually there should be a lot of interest?
Yeah. So great question to start off with. People are always very confused. So the first is when we talk about the ETFs, the Hong Kong spot Bitcoin ETFs that we talk about don't allow mainland investors. So that's part of the main reason why the different ETFs have different. The American side has had a lot more demand. I think the current status of Bitcoin, within mainland China is a little bit of a gray state. People are allowed to hold it still, but there's a lot of restrictions on trading on it. Exchanges are banned. There was a Bitcoin mining ban effectively placed in a national level, so there were Bitcoin miners where a lot of them were expelled from China, and so not a very friendly environment. Hong Kong is a little bit different. Hong Kong, as of now, has differences in the basic law that will probably permit Bitcoin to be freely convertible along with Tether in any situation with the Hong Kong dollar. But of course, they also are trying to regulate that trade through using licensed exchanges and kind of closing down some of the peer-to-peer and over-the-counter trading, which is you could just show up to a mall. I believe there's about like 1,000 of these places in Hong Kong where you can go for you bring cash, you bring Tether, you can get cash, Hong Kong dollars back. You can even get Bitcoin and Lightning and trade in that way as well. So that's kind of a basic overview, but happy to go more into detail if there's other questions on
Yeah,
that.
let's say if we look at this from the geopolitical point of view, how do you see, do you really think there might be slowly this race that I mentioned brewing, and maybe both governments are preparing slowly for, some competition in this regard?
Yeah, no, I mean, Richard, this is a very hot topic right now in a lot of circles. Geopolitics, Bitcoin. I think we saw. I was actually in Nashville when Trump
Yes,
gave his
that would be
speech.
my next question. Yes.
Yeah. And so definitely a lot more geopolitical attention. I've also done some reporting and written about the state of play in Congress. And so there's a lot more attention on it. I think that in China itself, so China still holds some level of Bitcoin, we know, even publicly, mostly through seizures, for example, the Plus token affair. So there might be 15,000 Bitcoin or something. Like there's all these little amounts from different either seizures or just anything else. So China does hold Bitcoin, the government itself. However, the United States currently is also kind of defaulting the same position. I mean, under the Harris administration, right? Like, they are kind of transiting the Bitcoin that they hold similarly from seizures, the Silk Road seizure, as well as the Bitfinex hack. There's about 210,000 Bitcoin the United States has, but that wasn't like actively accumulated. So one of the only governments that's actively accumulating right now is El Salvador. El Salvador is buying a Bitcoin a day and they have it on the treasury. but the United States and China both are not actively, buying Bitcoin, adding it to their
I
reserves.
think maybe Bhutan might still be
Bhutan is
accumulating,
mining. Bhutan is mining.
and I guess also accumulating or not.
They are accumulating an amount, but I think they most often sell it. Correct. But yeah, but there is. I mean, the three largest government holders right now are the United States, the United Kingdom. But the United Kingdom, actually, the Bitcoin comes from China, which is also an interesting story as well. The GM fraud case, and then China. Most likely, China is probably the third largest holder at this point because Germany sold all
Yes.
the Bitcoin that
What
it
about
seized.
Ethiopia? They just started mining.
What about where?
Ethiopia.
Oh, Ethiopia. The government. So I think I actually did this analysis for Forbes that will hopefully come out sometime soon, and it tracks all the largest governments and their holdings. And so I don't. I think Ethiopia has Bitcoin mining equipment,
Yes, yes,
but I don't know that they're like holding it as a publicly announced reserve. So yeah. So similarly, so El Salvador has like publicly traceable, like they have an office that will print
yes.
that they have the Bitcoin. But to your earlier question, is there a race? I think that obviously the Chinese Party state will look carefully at whatever American policymakers are doing. I think if Trump is elected, and I think there's significant movement on both stable coins, which a lot of people in Asia use as well as the idea of actually accumulating Bitcoin proactively. Because remember, the United States government has never actively went out there and bought Bitcoin, right? But in this case, Trump is probably going to either not sell the Bitcoin the U.S. government has seized, or even maybe proactively add to it, which is kind of what El Salvador is doing. And I think the Chinese Party state will probably have to study that. I do think there are reasons why they might not do it. Some of there is like an ideological basis, and I think they've tried to take a policy path towards the digital yuan, which we can talk a little bit more about. So I think it will be a little bit difficult to do it like above board. But I know, for example, there are miners who have come back to China and signed deals with like local governments and things like that, right? So there are probably some government entities, including the courts and other places that hold Bitcoin. Whether that's going to be like a strategic reserve, I think that will depend. I don't think it's like that likely, but I know that they'll study what happens in the United States very closely. So certainly, the United States, this will be a very interesting election because if Trump gets elected, we don't exactly know. Obviously, words are just words until they become, part of the policy bills and laws. But the Republican platform was quite aggressively pro, like anti CBDC, central bank digital currency, such as the digital yuan, and then pro. I would say crypto more because a lot of the politicians are very crypto oriented as opposed to just purely Bitcoin. So certainly, I think some of that will translate into policy, and at the very least, I think you'll have the Biden administration. I think was more openly hostile towards Bitcoin, if
Yeah,
that
but
makes
as
sense.
of now, 50% of global mining is, I think, in China, right? We have kind of the US, Texas, the biggest location, and China, right?
Yeah, so that's the level of. So it's very hard to tell like how many physical miners are around because there's like they're tied to an IP address, but IP addresses are very fungible. Meaning the IP address can be changeable or they're very malleable, which obviously some of your listeners will be very familiar with because of the whole VPN thing. But I would say that most of the hashing, there's been a significant change in the hash rate for Bitcoin mining, which is now run by American public companies, such as Marathon and others that are mining kind of at an institutional level and using pools like Foundry. So by far in Bitcoin's past, it was likely mostly Chinese miners, and the mining pools and exchanges that came out of that were mostly Chinese origin. And but there's a nuance here. Like even though the mining pools are technically like have Chinese roots, at the end of the day, they're running software, and miners can really join them from anywhere. And technically, a lot of the mining pools have banned Chinese IP addresses. So there is a little bit of like difficulty tracking exactly how much hash power is coming from China. But to your general point, yes, some of the hash power has returned. There was definitely a big shift in 2021 where it became more American, and there was a lot of American public companies that raised a lot of venture capital to secure kind of wholesale electricity rates. So there was definitely that shift. But to your point, I mean, Bitmain, the manufacturer of, the mining chips that are used, and help me if it's helpful, I can also explain to the audience what Bitcoin mining is or things like that. I'm kind of assuming that they're,
No,
but
probably not, because the channel is more about the geopolitical issue, not so
okay,
much
okay.
for Bitcoiners, but it's definitely still interesting. I have one. Okay, do you have something you would like to add? Or if not, then I would have a follow-up question.
I'll end off on a more geopolitical note. So the U.S.-China trade war definitely did affect this as well. So because Bitmain is a Chinese origin company, the tariffs did apply, and so it was actually a large part of semiconductor trade into the United States. And so I know one thing that's been happening is that this Chinese manufacturing is actually being more and more decentralized in the sense of like the chips themselves are being manufactured in countries like Indonesia or Malaysia in order to escape these sanctions. So that's more of a geopolitical side.
Studio Asia is an independent channel. I am neither looking for sponsors, nor asking you for donations. I value much more your comment under this interview. It means a lot to me, a lot. Subscribing and sharing helps me to be promoted by YouTube. I will appreciate it very, very much.
Especially this year, there's been a big outflow of the Chinese super rich. A lot of them left
Sure.
China. So do they use maybe Bitcoin as a as means to let, to remove their wealth with them, to take it with them out of China? Because that would be probably the safest way and easiest, most convenient way for them to take their money with them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that first, it's very hard to tell, right? It's very, very hard to tell whether or not this is happening or not. Now, effectively, most trade that's trackable. So we will never, as a reporter on the space, we will never really have access to the over-the-counter trades. These are trades that happen, either peer to peer. So you can imagine people, meeting physically, trading over phones, or what's called over-the-counter trading, which is a lot more not obscure, but like basically you think of like private banking or something similar to that. But you go to like a place, you like usually it's like WhatsApp message or something or some kind of communication, and you say like, hey, I want to buy really large amounts of Bitcoin or sell really large amounts of Bitcoin. But that's all off exchange. So that'll get recorded in the Bitcoin blockchain, but it will be impossible for external observers to say like, oh, this transaction was because someone traded renminbi for that. So there's no exchange now that will accept renminbi for Bitcoin or vice versa. So there's no on ramp, off ramp, and so most of the trade is conducted in Tether. So that's the first thing. Like it's hard to tell, but from what we can observe previously, and I covered that in my book, Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? There was observed behavior. Like for example, there were people who bought Bitcoin with renminbi and then sold it quickly in another currency. And that would have been like an example of like traceable capital flight. I know through more like qualitative and not quantitative, but there recently was a survey of like 2,000 crypto users that there is this behavior where high net worth individuals are, dealing with OTC desks, right? They're making these like large trades back and forth. Some of the really large Bitcoin businesses were built in China. I mean, Binance was built originally in China,
Yes.
right? A lot of the mining companies. So there is a lot of flow. There are definitely OTC desks around the world that trade. It's some amount of the capital outflows. When it was studyable, it wasn't like the hugest amount. We were talking about a few billion dollars. So definitely not like the largest contributor. I mean, Chinese people are, getting their money out of the system in all kinds of different ways, right? But was a factor. I definitely think that this is one of the reasons why China, the government looked to crack down on Bitcoin, for sure. That like their definition of money laundering encompasses, escaping capital controls. So yeah, but I think one other thing I will say is that what I've noticed is there's a lot of demand because what you observed, and Richard, you're entirely correct. Like obviously as studying the space, like China's economy is going through a little bit of a downturn, right? And so if you're in real estate, you're in assets,
Yeah,
and remember,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, like like if you have your money parked in China, that's why people are buying bonds all of a sudden, right? Because there is not really a safe yield or a safe return. I have noticed that there seems to be more Chinese-based companies and also Chinese-based investor groups that are interested in like layer two Bitcoin kind of applications or Bitcoin itself. So that I've definitely noticed as well. And I think that just like it just correlated with like how do you get your money to like return? And right now in China, that's like a very hard question to answer.
I know you posted recently a story about Bitcoin in Thailand, but that's more like an anecdote. Like, what general trends do you see in Asia? I think there are supposed to be ETFs accepted in South Korea, but that's still an issue. So, how do you see it region wide developing?
Yeah, a really interesting dynamic now. I mean, China has a lot of weight, but obviously, even across the region, there's many different opinions. I think Singapore and Hong Kong are both competing in different ways. Hong Kong wants to be like a virtual assets hub, so not just Bitcoin, but obviously they launched the spot Bitcoin ETFs. There's some motion in Singapore. I'm actually going to be releasing an interview pretty soon, I think in the next few weeks, which will go into detail between the differences between the two, between someone who has a lot of experience doing trade in both Hong Kong and Singapore. So I don't want to butcher everything that he said. So that will come out like in full. A lot of the other regional players have kind of like a bit of a neutral to negative view. I feel like India is an interesting example where they're piloting a central bank digital currency, and they have restricted Bitcoin in some ways. I'm not as precise about how they've done that, but I know that there are some restrictions. Um, I think in Japan, South Korea, so South Korea has been famous for being a place where there was a lot of activity. There still is a premium because they have their own version of capital controls, I think, in terms of the Korean won. So I know that there's always been a long-standing premium to buy Bitcoin and Korean won, which I think has persisted. Um, I think ever since Terra, which was a stable coin built in South Korea, the founder kind of the whole project collapsed and then was arrested by Interpol. I think since then the Koreans have tried to be more conservative on that front. One thing that's been interesting, and this is just because I was talking to more, because I also have I mean, I write a lot about Bitcoin, but I have also worked in the past with a lot of writers on China, Asia writ large. And one thing that's been an intersect in the story in terms of like the regionality of it, which has been interesting to see, is actually I'll give you two. So the first is, are you familiar with like pig butchery? Or so it's very interesting. It's like people in Southeast Asia, and it's become a large part of the economy, in places like Burma, Myanmar, and other border regions of China, where they essentially scam mainland Chinese citizens, and normally they get the money out through cryptocurrency of some kind. So I know that's been a really interesting interplay because like that's happening now, and that's become like a really large part of the economy for some of these countries, which I find really interesting.
You mean running those scams?
Yeah, like running the scams, and then the people are extracting money out, and then there's some like so one thing I was trying to follow up on a little bit more is like Binance works with different governments and entities. I don't want to be too like on the nose with that, but for example, like if you look at their job postings, one of my friends was talking about this. They're in government held areas of Myanmar versus the other. So there is some amount of so there's a little bit of back and forth, and we know some exchanges and some of the OTC desks still work with the Chinese government. They're cited in like arrest reports and things like that. So there's this kind of like interesting confluence between geopolitics and Bitcoin, which is, I think, somewhat of a larger story. So if you all saw, like, I think like the border region, the Shan region recently extradited a few people responsible And that must have been like a complex interplay between all these players that we're describing right now. So I know that's gotten a lot of interest from like people even outside of like Bitcoin circles. But in terms of like the competitiveness, I mean, most countries in the region, including Taiwan, neutral to negative, I would say. But I would say that there's quite a few signs of bottoms up adoption in Korea, in Japan, and I think that Hong Kong and Singapore are trying to compete to be a hub for financial inflows.
Dear Studio Asian, if you've gotten that far and not commented nor liked, shame on you. Also sub for more Studio Asia.
Hello, Bitcoiners. Thank you very much. Hello, it's good to be with you.
Let's switch to the US and the Nashville conference. You've been there. How was it?
Yeah, it was a very interesting experience. So you have to understand, I've been writing about Bitcoin since 2014, and I got involved much earlier. And so it's just so wild to see that you have these like meetups of like tiny, passionate people. You know, you might have like 3 or 4 people. There was this individual called Andreas Antonopoulos, was like kind of like the foremost educator in the space. And there's like photos of him talking to like rooms of like 3 or 4 people,
Yes, yes.
right? And that was just 10 years ago.
Yeah, when Bitcoin was at $100, nobody wanted to listen. Yeah,
Exactly. Nobody wants to listen. Now we're at a very, it's a very interesting moment because, you know, when you're in it, you're like zooming out, you're like, oh, some of what Bitcoin is about is like be your own bank. But now all the banks seem to be, or, you know, all the financial institutions, Fidelity, well, Fidelity was always kind of into it, but like, you know, even you see like a JP Morgan say like, hey, like we don't endorse Bitcoin, but now they're involved as like a buyer through like the ETF. So you see a lot of these interesting things, right? So Nashville was really interesting because that's where the political side started to hit. And this is where I think in Asia and China, this will reverberate a little bit larger.
America first. Because if we don't do it, China's going to be doing, others are going to be doing it. Let's do it and do it right. My vision is for an America that.
But, you know, you had Trump come in, of course. But what I think was probably missing for people who were not at the conference is just how much political attention it brought, like even just randomly. So, you know, you had Senator Tim Scott, who just like came along for the ride. And normally he'd be a keynote speaker at any number of industry conventions. Likely, if the Republicans get the Senate, he may actually be the Senate majority leader, right? And definitely was, you know, part of the financial services kind of framework. I might be misquoting this, but like I believe he served on the Financial Services Committee. So, you know, that's just like randomly. Ron Paul randomly showed up. Like there was a lot of, it was very, very, very random. And that was kind of the attention that Trump brought. But again, I'm just going back to like, it's just such a weird moment, at least for someone, I've been in this space for like a really long time. And it's just so weird to see sometimes, but it brought a different energy and it did feel like Bitcoin grew up. I'll buy it. The speech that Trump gave, a lot of it was leaked beforehand. So it kind of missed some of the impact. So people knew he was probably going to announce a strategic Bitcoin reserve. People knew he was going to say like a lot of the different things he had already said before at like, for example, the Libertarian Party convention and things like that. But I do think that like seeing all that energy, I imagine other countries, including China, have to watch because that's just like their number one priority. And so it definitely felt like the world is more focused. And now whether or not, you know, there's people, including a lot of people who write for Bitcoin Magazine, who, you know, think China might unban or China might watch or do this. I certainly think that countries will watch. And there is that kind of, to your first question, I think there is that game theory of like countries and then individuals kind of adopting it. And yeah, especially if he gets elected. I mean, the reaction to it was also very interesting. I also still sometimes don't know what to think about it because, you know, you have the former president coming to talk to our like previously our meetup of like 10 or 20 passionate devotees, now 20, 30,000 people. And so it's just become a very different topic. I think that started with the ETFs, and then certainly now with Trump has become a much bigger geopolitical thing.
My last question. Tell me a little bit about the book. Why Mao and why Bitcoin?
Yeah, no. So I think that so first, like when I wrote the book, I actually called it a very nuanced title, I thought, which was One Country, Two Blockchains. Of course, referring to the one country, two systems. And like China's very obsessed with like blockchain. They have claimed the most blockchain patents in the world. But then obviously, certain members of the party are very against Bitcoin, right? Assumably, Xi may or may not be. He's never made a public statement, but he's definitely made a public statement on blockchain, and he thinks it's one of those like technologies China has to embrace. So that was originally the title. Ended up working with Bitcoin Magazine. They were kind of like, well, it has the word blockchain. We don't really love the word blockchain in Bitcoin Magazine, so you have to have something Bitcoin related. So the book itself, if we want to talk about it, it really starts more in the 80s. I mean, it mentions some of the stuff with Mao. Obviously, Mao has such an imprint on Chinese history. I have to really clarify, I am no fan of Mao at all. My family suffered a lot, actually, because of the actions of Mao. And so it's definitely not meant to be a homage to him, if that makes sense. But when we discussed it, first with like the title designer, but then also with my publisher, I think it was just the idea to convey that to especially either Bitcoiners or people in the West who were interested more in how Bitcoin evolved within China. And the question is like, what do we assume that people in the States know about Chinese history? The more accurate title would have been something like, how would Deng think about, is Bitcoin one of Deng's cats, or whatever, any number of sly things on that. But the unfortunate reality is like, I just don't think that most of the audience in the Bitcoin audience, and I spend most of my time talking to Bitcoiners, though always love opportunities to talk to a broader audience, are not as familiar with the Deng Xiaoping, the economic reform and opening up and sort of even what China is now, right? Like it's a very kind of interesting back and forth question. So in summary, would Mao hold Bitcoin? Why Mao? Because he, is the thing that would stand out to the audience. And we were kind of trying to be not like clever with the book cover, but the idea was that if Bitcoin is somewhat censored in China, to have probably not a good thing for me to be saying this publicly, but to have Mao not censored, but like pixelated, certainly kind of conveys the message, and it's a little bit like tongue in cheek, a tiny little bit in that way. But the book itself actually starts more Deng Xiaoping and Shenzhen, how that rose, and really, I hope that people in your audience will read it because it actually speaks more. Forget about if you're interested in Bitcoin or not. I happen to be fascinated by it, but it's more like think about all the technologies and think about the fact that China is trying to leapfrog through the use of choke point technologies, through the use of control of technical development and technical economic development. So if you think about our current economic moment or our current historical moment in that lens, studying any one of these technologies, I find Bitcoin to be the most interesting because it has a lot of Chinese founders, has a lot of Chinese people interested in it, and the Chinese party state is against it, or some members of it are, right? So that I find really interesting. So I encourage that study, obviously Bitcoin in China, but even if it's not Bitcoin in China, if it's anything related in terms of that technical development piece, I do think that is going to determine this geopolitical moment. It's like which model is the best for getting innovation, real lasting innovation that delivers what people want. And I just happen to have the opinion that people want control of their own funds, that they want control of their own destiny and freedoms. But other people may also have other views. But that's why the book at this current moment, more than just like a study of Bitcoin in China, what I've also told people is it's about the two characters and this greater story of how do we want what do we want the world to look like? What models do we think can be successful? And what are the world's technology and then thus geopolitics going to look like in the future?
Fantastic. Yeah, we can definitely agree that Asia and Bitcoin are the future. That's quite clear. Roger, thank you very much for your time. It was really a pleasure.
I appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
I have so many other explosive interviews on this and similar topics. Please check out my channel.